All right, well, welcome back to class as we head into our final lecture of the day as we continue to look at the issues of hermeneutics, and that is how we actually study the Bible. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at historical and cultural context. So again, to go back to our illustration that sort of frames the entire journey that we're on, remember we painted this picture as though we were traveling to another village. That is the village of the past, the village of the context in which the Bible was originally written and spoken by the prophets. And we need to go to their village to see the surroundings of their village and understand it in their village before we try to bring the good news back to our village. And so this lecture will be on sort of seeing the surroundings within their village. So to stretch our analogy a little bit further, if I were to try to give you directions, think for a moment, close your eyes if you will, and think about trying to give directions to your house to someone who has never been to your house. What would you have to do in order to describe to me how to walk to your house? Well, you would have to tell me about streets that I've never been on. You would have to describe what we call landmarks, right? A notable tree or rock or perhaps another notable building that I would have to see and recognize in order to understand where it is that you live. In the same way, I would have to do that if you were to come to my house, be able to describe which streets you would have to walk on, which buildings to look for in order to know how you were getting within your surroundings. When we talk about historical and cultural context, we're talking about those issues within the context of an Old Testament or New Testament book, so that we can understand where these people were living, how it affected their thoughts, and thus understand their thoughts within context. Again, the entire purpose is to get back to what the original author, human author, of the text meant when we read the Bible. So we've discussed reading sentences and discourses, and indeed that's the most important part. We need to set on the meaning of the text first, but then place that meaning within a context, right? So why should we do this? Why is this important, and I would say even essential, and what God commands us to do as we study a biblical text? Well, number one, God spoke his Bible, his message, into specific historical situations. And we must take into account those historical and cultural situations. Isaiah tells us that in the fullness of time, God sends. So God chose to send Jesus in a specific context. Could God have just written on the sky everything that we needed to know for all time? He could have. But he chose in his wisdom that that was not the best way to reveal himself to us, and instead to reveal himself in times and places, which tells us that God values these times and places, and they are part of the truth which God is communicating. So it is not a mistake that Jesus was born as a first century AD Jewish man in Rome. That's not a mistake, or in Rome and Jerusalem, I should say. It's not a mistake, and we need to factor that in when we think about the message that Jesus taught. God chose to bring Jesus in that time. When we've talked about Isaiah with Dr. Jones earlier in the day today, we are thinking in terms of a 6th century BC prophet. We need to think about what's going on and why God sent that message in that time. You know, the question was given, like, what would Isaiah preach today? Well, we all wonder that, right? That's a very good question in one sense, because we wonder, what would Isaiah say to us? But in another sense, it's not a good question, because we need to ask, what was Isaiah saying to his people? That's when God chose to send Isaiah. God did not choose to send Isaiah to us. He chose to send Isaiah to them. And that was an important decision for God to make. So we have to ask, why? What was important about that time that gives us more information about the message that God was giving in that book? So since we live in a different context, we must understand God's original intended meaning in the ancient historical context before we can apply it to ourselves. Now, I often give this illustration to help us understand this. If I were to go into the storage room in my grandmother's house, My grandmother is 90 years old. My grandfather passed away years ago. And if we go to her house and we visit her and we go through some of her things, and perhaps we find some letters that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother back in the 1940s when he was a soldier in the U.S. Army during World War II. Now, are those letters that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother, are they significant to me? Oh, they're very significant to me. They teach me so much about my heritage and my grandfather and his love for my grandmother. I wouldn't be on this earth if not for that relationship. So it's very important to me. But will I understand those letters if I read them as though they were written to me? No. They aren't written directly to me. They were written to my grandmother. So I have to understand her relationship with my grandfather before I can begin to understand my significance in the story. Those are very important. Those are my family's letters. They are for me, but they're not to me directly. Now, the Bible is even more broadly applicable to that because God is its author. It is written for our good as an example to us, but the illustration still holds. I need to understand the significance to my grandmother before I can understand the significance to me. In the same way, when we read a historical document like the books of the Bible, we have to understand their significance to the original audience before we can understand their significance to us. And part of that significance is understanding the historical and cultural context. Number 3, only when we understand the original meaning of the text can we begin to apply it to our lives in the way God intended. There is a way in which God intends us to apply the Bible. Have you ever thought about that? That we are responsible as pastors and church leaders to apply the Bible in the way God intended. It's not ours to decide what every passage means and then apply it however we want. We can't read our own intentions into the text. We have to take God's intentions out of the text and make sure we're applying it in the way He wanted it to be applied. So in order to do that, we have to understand why He gave the text in its original interpretation. Now, there may be a vast number of different ways we can appropriately apply a text, but only when we understand its true meaning. And so we have to dive into the text and understand its original context. So to give the illustration, the historical and cultural context is like the landmarks on your street that let you know where your house is located, right? The notable trees or rocks or other houses that tell you I'm in this area where my home is located. In the same way, historical and cultural context gives us a kind of location, so to speak, when we're talking about a book of the Bible. So specifically, what is historical and cultural context? This kind of context refers to things outside of the text that describe and help us understand what is inside the text. More specifically, it is information about the history and people and places described in the text that help us understand it. It's not hidden information, hidden codes, mysteries, revelations. It's none of those things. It is information about the text that helps clarify things in the text. Just to give us some illustration, let's give some examples of what good historical contextual knowledge is so that you can start finding it when you study the Bible. First off, open your Bibles with me to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. We're going to look at several instances where information that is outside of the text itself clarifies something that is within the text. All right, so turn to Acts chapter 17 in your Bibles. And we're going to look at a sermon that Paul gives in Acts chapter 17. So Acts chapter 17, verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. So as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What you therefore worship is unknown. Therefore I proclaim to you, the God who made heaven and earth and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he gives himself to all mankind life and breath and everything. So here's a wonderful statement about the truth of God. We would need to study it just like we've already talked about in terms of its sentences, in terms of its discourse, and we would learn a great many things about God. But already apparent in this is that we have some historical context going on. Paul is going to a place. He tells us in verse 22 that he's in Athens. So right away we have a historical contextual question. Where is Athens? Well, Athens is in ancient Greece. It was the capital of ancient Greece, one of the great city-states of ancient Greece. And Paul is in a specific place in Athens. He's in the Areopagus. Well, if we're studying our text closely, we should want to know, what is the Areopagus and why is it important? Why would Paul choose to preach a sermon in the Areopagus? We would want to know about Roman or Greek temples, because Paul specifically wants to talk about them, and Roman and Greek worship, because he's calling out their worship and comparing it with the worship of the true God. So what is historical and cultural context that would help us understand this teaching in Acts chapter 17? Well, I've been to the Areopagus in ancient Greece, and it actually sits just below the Temple Mount of Athens. It was a hill, sometimes called Mars Hill, just below the great mountain on the top, in the middle of the city of Athens, where the great temples to all of the Greek gods were set. So as Paul was teaching this sermon, he would have been looking up with the temples just towering up behind him and constant smoke going up from all of the offerings that were being offered to the gods. And the Greeks believed that different gods controlled different aspects of the universe. So there was a god who was in charge of death, and if you feared death, you would sacrifice to that god. There was a god who was in charge of the growing of crops, and if you wanted your crops to grow well, you would sacrifice to that god. There was a goddess of love, and if you wanted to find the love of your life, you would go and sacrifice to that goddess. All of these gods and spirits control different little aspects of worship that you, as a human being, would go and try to gather, get all these gods on your side with your worship, manipulate them to help you out. And this was going on like a drama right behind Paul as he was preaching this, because he's standing in the Areopagus, which is just below the Temple Mount. So this reality would be unavoidable. Every Greek person and Roman person in his audience would have seen this going on. And in the midst of that, Paul says, the real God does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands. In other words, he doesn't need your sacrifices. You can't manipulate him. You can't get anything from him. But instead, he gives all things to all people out of the abundance of his grace. Do you see how the historical context helps us understand in a deeper way, in a clearer way, what Paul is saying? It doesn't change anything about what Paul is saying. There's no hidden mystery that we couldn't have read in the text, but the historical context explains why Paul is saying these things at that place and why they have a special meaning in this place. So the historical context is information like that, which gives us more information to better understand the text. And it's needful if you plan to be any kind of teacher to access this kind of information. Let me give you another illustration. Turn to Matthew chapter 8. The book of Matthew chapter 8. We're going to look at another instance where historical and cultural context are very important to understanding the text. This is going to be a simple one, Matthew chapter 8, and we'll read in verses 1 through 5. When he came down from the mountain, this being Jesus, great crowds were following him. And behold, a man with leprosy came to him and knelt down before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. All right, already this verse, or these group of verses rather, is demanding that we go in search of some context. Why? Well, he specifically tells us about a gift that Moses commanded. If you're studying this passage, you should immediately say, what gift did Moses command? What is Jesus referring to? Well, Jesus is referring to the Old Testament law, which commanded that when someone was cleansed of leprosy, they would have to give an offering as proof that they had in fact been cleansed, to be reintroduced to the society. That demands more information from us right there. Why were people with leprosy not allowed within society? And what did that entail? Well, we would have to go to the Old Testament and read the laws about leprosy. We would find out that people with leprosy were so unclean, they had an infectious disease that could cause other people to get sick, and therefore for the safety of society and for the cleanliness of Israel's worship, showing the purity of God, that he's not part of sin or the effects of sin, they had to be removed from the camp. And people with leprosy would go outside the camp. They couldn't live with their families and their tribes inside the rest of Israel. So already we're starting to see this context is growing our understanding, which gives us even more insight into how Jesus heals the man. Do you notice that throughout the New Testament, Jesus heals people in a variety of different ways? He sometimes will speak to people. We're going to look at another passage here in just a moment where he heals someone from far away. Sometimes he uses words, sometimes he doesn't use words. Sometimes he touches them, sometimes he uses things. So, for example, the man born blind, Ben told us about the double healing that involves a kind of mud salve that Jesus makes. He doesn't need to use mud, but he chooses to in that situation. So what is significant about this healing? Well, the man is touched. Why is that important? Well, because it was against the Hebrew law to touch someone with leprosy. Again, that's historical and cultural context, which gives greater significance and clarity to what Jesus is doing. He reaches out and touches an untouchable person. So we see that having this historical and cultural information, which requires us to slow down, ask questions of the text, and then seek information that isn't inside the immediate text, actually clarifies and adds meaning to the text. Again, this isn't secret. It's not revealing anything that wasn't there. Rather, it's providing information surrounding the text to clarify it for us. One last illustration. We'll go on to just the next section. In verse 5, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came towards him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is paralyzed at home and suffering terribly." And he said, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion said, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Comes,' and he comes. And to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled at him and said, "Truly, I tell you, no one in Israel has shown me such faith." Now, what's some historical context that's important to this story? Well, right away, the text itself starts provoking some questions. What is a centurion? Well, a centurion is a Roman official, a leader of a group of troops. And so the centurion already hints at the significance of his position when he says that he can simply order his troops around, tell his servants what to do. He's a soldier with soldiers under him, so he can command them to do as he pleases. And he assumes that Jesus has a similar command over even illness, that Jesus is, to put it in the words of the centurion, sort of the commander of the troops of the world. And he can tell illnesses to go away if he chooses to do so. But a centurion is not a Jew. This is also interesting because Jesus says that he hasn't found this kind of faith in Israel. Why would he say that? Because the centurion is not a son or daughter of Israel. Centurion is a Roman official. He's a foreigner, an invader, actually, of Israel. See, the Israelites were occupied by Roman armies who had beat them in battle and now controlled Israel. They were the enemies of Jesus' people. They were from another tribe, to put it in another way, a victorious tribe who had taken over Israel. And Jesus here is treating this centurion with kindness and love, and even condemning Israel, saying that this tribesman from an attacking foreign tribe has more faith than the Israelites. So all of this information about what a centurion is, where they come from, gives us more insight into the passage. This is what context can do for us. It clarifies what's going on and where it's going on, why it's going on, so that we can begin to understand greater things about the passage. Again, this is not finding secret meanings. This is not about finding spiritualistic interpretations. It's about historical information that tells us more about the meaning of the passage. Let me give you an example of what context, historical, and cultural is not. I heard a false teacher give the illustration that Peter walking on the water, you know the story from the book of Matthew. If we read on in chapter 8, we would begin to encounter it, that Jesus walks on the water in the midst of a storm. Peter walks out to him. He begins to fall into the sea, and Jesus picks him up and pulls him back into the boat because of his little faith. And I heard a false teacher try to use this illustration to say that because of his special knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, he had discovered that the boat was a representation of the church, and that everyone was supposed to come to his church. He was pulling them out of other places, of other evil churches, and into his church, which was the only church that had salvation. That's a spiritualistic interpretation. That's a false teacher hiding behind promises of secret meanings in historical understandings or special understandings of Greek and Hebrew. It's not historical context. So we are not looking for secret meanings or different meanings. We're not looking for anything that would change the plain meaning of the text. We're looking for information which clarifies, which adds context, like the landmarks around your house, which allow you to place it within its context and tell people about where it's located. It's the same thing with historical and cultural context. So we've given this some definition as to what it is that we're looking for. Now, how do we start to find it? Well, we start to find it by asking good questions in these categories. First off, we ask good questions about the biblical writer. God chose to write his word through specific human authors. And to understand what they are writing, we have to understand them. So whenever we approach any book of the Bible, any passage, we should ask, who is this author? What is significant about them? What is their background? When did they write? What kind of ministry did they have? What was his relationship with the people he wrote about? And most important, why did he write this particular text? Now, Dr. Jones has already given us a wonderful illustration of doing this with the book of Isaiah. This is why we always put our teachings together with teachings on a specific book. Think of the last 2 days. Dr. Jones has explained to us who Isaiah was, how the book is put together, when Isaiah was writing. He's explained to us what an Old Testament prophet is in the context of the Old Testament, how Isaiah is calling the people back to the law of God, and Dr. Jones has used specific examples from the Bible to explain when Isaiah was happening in the context of the entire Old Testament. He's explained to us how Isaiah was using the Old Testament law and shown us Bible verses to prove that that's in fact what Isaiah was doing. He's explained to us the context of Isaiah's followers and what they were doing, how they interacted with Isaiah, how they didn't interact with Isaiah. He's explained to us how Isaiah interacted with Israel's kings. So all of that was Dr. Jones doing good contextual work in helping us understand the biblical writer. We could do the same thing with many other passages. What if we were to take the book of Matthew, where we've been spending our time with illustrations this afternoon? Well, we could ask about, who is Matthew? Do you know? Matthew is a disciple of Jesus. We find out in his own gospel that he was a tax collector, which also adds an interesting amount of context to Matthew telling the story of the centurion, because Matthew would have been a Roman official. Matthew would have been someone working for the enemy, so to speak. So we need to understand who they are. What is their relationship to the people around them? How is their writing significant? So we begin finding historical and cultural context by asking questions about the biblical writer. We come back to this again and again and again. In order to be a good student of the biblical text, you must ask questions of it. As preachers and pastors, we often want to come with answers. We want to come with, what am I going to say? What am I going to proclaim? What is the big hook in my sermon going to be? And we must slow down and begin to ask questions and ask important historical questions to find context before we go to application. If you take away nothing else, hear this and this. We want to slow down. Do not jump to application. Do not jump to what the big moment in your sermon is going to be. Start with questions about what it meant at the time. All right? Number 3, we need to ask questions about the audience. So we've looked at the author who's speaking or writing this work. Then we have to ask questions about the audience who's listening to this work. Who are the people that are being written to? What is their background? What are their current circumstances? What is happening to them? And most importantly, this is a key one, listen to this. What are the causes or issues that would cause this author to write this book to them? Again, Dr. Jones has given us a great lesson in how to do this in the book of Isaiah. He's told us about what it was like for Israel to be in exile, what they had done, how they had sinned against the law, which had brought them into a place where they needed to be called back to the law by Isaiah, by this prophet who was reteaching them the law in a season in which they weren't following it. He's given us the cause of what provoked this book to be written and why we can understand its meaning in that context. We need to do the same kind of work whenever we are preparing a lesson in any other biblical book. So we could ask the same thing in the book of Matthew. Why is Matthew writing? What is he writing down these stories about Jesus for? Well, we know that Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. He was transformed by the life of Jesus, and he would want to share this transformation that he experienced with others. But we can also see in the beginning of the book that Matthew has a very particular idea in mind. Turn back to the beginning of the book of Matthew. And what does Matthew say in chapter 1, verse 1? The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. So Matthew's goal is to present to you the son of David, the son of the king, the heir to the throne of Israel. He says, I want to tell you what Israel's true king is like. This is what Israel's true king looks like. And the rest of his book is going to be about the king of Israel and what it looked like for Israel to get its true king. Those things like the purpose of the book and the audience that it was written for, we can assume here that Matthew has in mind Jews reading this book and understanding what their real king is like, the son of David returning to the throne, because he tells us this is the case. So again, I would ask you just to encourage us to grow in this as teachers and preachers. Do you do this when you prepare your sermons? Many of you are probably thinking about and preparing sermons that you are planning to preach just a few days from now, when we take a break from class on Sunday. Maybe you'll be preaching either in church or planning to do some street preaching or some evangelism, and you've been thinking of what you're going to be preaching on. Have you done this contextual work? Have you asked all of these questions of the text that you're going to be working on? You need to. You need to think through these things in order to accurately teach a text. So we've looked at asking these questions about the biblical writer. We've looked at asking these questions about the biblical audience. And then we need to ask these questions about other historical and cultural elements. This is very broad. I realize that's the case, and it's going to be different for every text. However, we can throw these into large categories which help us to think through some of the questions we need to ask. we need to know something about the historical elements. History is the passage of time and what's happening in the passage of time. So when does this text happen? And I'm not just asking about the year, whether or not you know it about any given book, but what has happened before, what is happening after, where is this book in the story of the Bible? So in the book of Isaiah, we see that it is after the founding of the kingdom of Israel, after the exile. But now the people are being called back. It's very significant that that book happens after the exile. With the book of Matthew, we look at the fact that this happens after the end of the Old Testament, after God has turned off all the prophets in the book of Malachi. The people are not receiving any prophetic ministry anymore from God because he's rejected them. And then in the fullness of time, in the midst of the Roman Empire, when Israel has been conquered and the temple's been defiled and they're being ruled over by a foreign power, then Matthew tells us the story of the coming of King Jesus. It's important to understand the historical background. When is this happening? Where is it happening? Looking at geographic relationships. Geographic relationships can often tell us something very important about what's happening within a text. So for example, when we read in many of the Old Testament prophets will talk about terror coming from the north. Terror coming from the north. Why would they talk about the north being such a scary place? Where I grew up in South Dakota is a very northerly place. And so what's north of South Dakota? Well, not much at all. Just a lot of snow. Why on earth would we be terrified of the north? Well, because God didn't write the prophets to South Dakota. He wrote them to ancient Israel. And ancient Israel was bounded by a sea on the west and a desert on the east, which means if they were going to be invaded by a foreign army, the army couldn't cross the sea and the army couldn't cross the desert. So they had to travel around and invade from the north. And only if you know a little bit about the geography of Israel do you understand what he's talking about. He's talking about the invading army of the Assyrians, who always invaded from the north. So something as simple as knowing a little bit of geography can sometimes tell us something about what's going on in a biblical passage. The geography of the Areopagus, right? Knowing that Paul is standing in a marketplace that is just below the Temple Mount of Greece, where all of these foreign gods would have been just behind and above him for everyone to see. That transforms our understanding of the passage, knowing something about the geography, knowing something about the society, right? We talked about that with the man who has leprosy, how lepers were pushed out of society. Another good illustration would be the woman at the well with Jesus in John chapter 4. A Samaritan woman comes to Jesus to speak with him. Well, if you know a little bit about Jewish and Samaritan relationships, you know that the Samaritans were rejected by the Jews. They were enemies of the Jews. And suddenly you see Jesus is reaching out not only to a woman, and women would not have talked to men, privately unless they were in their families. And a Samaritan wouldn't be talking to a Jew because they were enemies. Suddenly some of this social understanding gives us a greater depth of understanding of just how far Jesus is reaching out with the gospel to an outcast. So understanding some of the social things, religious things. We talked about this a little bit in the context of the man with leprosy, that there was a law against Jesus touching this man. There were sacrifices that needed to be made to make this man clean. Political issues. We talked about the fact that the centurion was an enemy of the Jews. He was a captain of the invading army. And there's political factors at play with Jesus reaching out to the centurion. Economic factors. Are the people in this text poor or rich? We could look at what's going on with people's money and why things are being said. They all give us insight to rightly understand how the text was applied. So for example, we're tempted to take texts and apply them directly to us without ever asking whether or not we are in the same or a similar social situation to the people in the text. And often we're not. So we need to ask these questions of the text, and a great way to do that is simply to go through these categories and apply them to whatever text we're reading at hand. To ask whether or not we know when this is happening within the Bible story, where it's happening. Do we know anything about the geography of the area, the political situation, the economic factors? And then, number 5, make a summary of specific historical and cultural contextual questions to ask about the text. We've gone through these already. You have more of them in your notes there. It's all of these same questions. Make a summary of them as you're studying a text so that you can begin to answer them. All right? Make a summary of these questions. I would encourage you, whenever you're studying for a sermon, have a notebook open. Be writing down questions. It is not enough. Hear us out on this, because we're going to say this again and again and again in this class. If you are a pastor, it is not enough to go on Saturday night, open your Bible, read a text, and decide what you're going to say. If you're doing that, you are not keeping your sacred trust to study the Scriptures, and you should not be preaching. If you're taking just a few minutes to open the Bible and hope that the Spirit gives you something to say, you are violating what God has given the task of a pastor to do. You're not being a pastor. You need to be studying the Word, studying to show yourself approved, Paul says. So you need to be taking days with the text. Your sermon preparation for next Sunday needs to begin on this Monday, where you're opening your Bible with a notebook open beside it and asking questions of the text, writing down all of these questions and finding out if their answers show you something about the meaning of the text. That is of key importance. And brothers and sisters, like I said, it's currently Tuesday. Many of you are probably thinking about whether you'll be preaching or evangelizing on Sunday. You need to be thinking about this right now. Is your text already selected? Have you begun already asking these questions of it? Because you need to be doing so, or you will not be adequately prepared to be preaching on Sunday. So you need to be asking these questions, writing them down. And now we'll be discussing how you can start to find the answers, okay? So once you have all these questions, you've asked lots of questions of the text. So, for example, the story of the man with leprosy. What is leprosy? What is the gift that Moses required to give? What's the context of that? When is this happening? Within the context of Matthew's gospel, within the context wider of salvation history. What is a centurion? Why is he talking to this man? What's the situation politically with the Romans and the Roman army? Asking all of those questions, and then we seek to find it. A few cautions, however, as you start to find it. First off, watch out for inaccurate background information. Inaccurate background information. You have to be careful that you don't fall into the trap of something being just a little too good to be true. Oftentimes, when it comes to sermon illustrations, we like to find the one little historical fact which just is so perfect that it illustrates everything. A very famous one is in Matthew 19, Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, it is easier for the camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And in the Old Testament, there was in fact in Jerusalem a gate called the Needle Gate. And somewhere along the way, a preacher falsely assumed, he was not correct, that, oh, here's this great story about a needle gate. Jesus must be talking about the needle gate. And so he's talking about a camel going through this gate into Jerusalem. And he thought that he had this wonderful illustration. The problem is, it was during the wrong time period. Jesus wasn't referring to that gate at all, because Jesus would have never called that gate the needle gate. So Jesus' illustration is literally talking about a camel, a large pack animal, going through the eye of a sewing needle, the little tiny hole. He's saying it's very difficult for a rich person to go into heaven because a rich person values their wealth and they need to let go of their wealth and value Jesus above everything. So having that little bit of historical illustration was, in fact, incorrect. And so we need to be careful that we don't get caught up on ideas, especially from famous preachers or things that we're listening to, that sort of draw us into thinking we found the super secret meaning of the text. But instead, we need to make sure that we're adding true information that helps us understand the full context. So make sure that the background information you're finding is accurate and that is from good sources. Number 2, be careful not to elevate the background of the text above the meaning of the text. Again, what's most important here is that we're finding the true meaning of the text as God intended it to the original authors. We're not looking for some secret meanings behind the text. We're not looking for something that reveals something secret. We're looking for something that clarifies what is actually there. So to give you an illustration, the history of the great city of Philippi. If we were to study the city of Philippi, we would find out about King Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. This was a conqueror who conquered the Greek world before the time of Paul. And we could study the stories of Alexander the Great. There's some fascinating history there. He conquered all of these cities. We could talk about it for hours and hours, and it'd be lots of interesting stories. But would we actually do better teaching Philippians chapter 2, where Paul tells us to have a mind like Christ? No. You actually don't need to know much about Alexander the Great in order to preach that passage. You need to know how Philippi was named for Alexander the Great and the fact that Alexander the Great had conquered the Roman world to understand when that book is happening. But you don't need to spend much time preaching about that in order to get to the heart of that text. So we need to understand historical context, but we don't need to let it overwhelm our preaching of a text. And as we, most people who are preachers and teachers, we like information. We like to grow in our knowledge of a text, and that's a good gift from the Lord that should be cultivated. But we have to be careful not to let it overwhelm preaching the true meaning of the text and its application to God's people. And this relates to number 3. Don't try to become merely a database of ancient facts to show off our knowledge of the Bible, to tell people all the wonderful things that we've found. We need to be careful as we're preparing our sermons that we're doing what needs to be applied to our people. All right? But in spite of these dangers, these little helpful things for us as preachers to avoid, it is still key for us to understand and study these resources. All right? So now I realize that most of you don't have access to large pastoral libraries at home. But because you do know English, you have more resources than those who do not. There are significant free resources for pastors who speak English, especially if you have even limited access to the internet. And I know that many of you have some access to the internet, and I'd encourage you, use that access to the internet for the glory of God. Use it to access good, free biblical resources rather than to watch videos or to message your friends. Use the data that you do have in ways that glorify God. So here are some things that you can, once you get that list of questions, some resources that you can access. And then at the end, I'm actually going to give you 3 websites that have many of these resources for free, so that if you have a phone, you can access these even as you prepare your sermon this week. One of these websites is entirely text-based, so it does not take much data to access it. All right? Number 1, the kinds of resources you can use once you've asked all those questions, you've written them down on your pad of paper. These are the resources you can go to. Number 1 is biblical handbooks. Biblical handbooks are a kind of book that simply answer general articles about the context of the Bible and the world of the Bible. So, for example, a good biblical handbook is the Baker Illustrated Bible Handbook. You can get it online in both digital and physical forms, and it will have things like maps or descriptions of cultural things. So, for example, in a Bible handbook, you could look up an article on leprosy, or you could look up an article on the temple, and it would tell you where the temple was, how it was built, some of the cultural things surrounding the temple. These are a great resource for understanding basic cultural and historical concepts, where you can look them up by word and keyword. Old and New Testament introductions and surveys. That's your second one there. These books provide background information for each book of the Bible. They're generally organized by book. So, for example, if we were to look at an Old Testament survey on the book of Isaiah, we would find much of the information that Dr. Jones has provided for us. Things like who Isaiah was, when Isaiah was written, how the book is put together, a basic outline of the book. So when you're preaching an Old Testament book or a New Testament book, having access to a basic introduction or survey is incredibly helpful. A few are noted there in your notes: an introduction to the Old Testament by Dillard and Longman, or an introduction to the New Testament by Carson and Moo. And Carson and Moo has been in print for about 20 years now. You can find old versions of it online. Number 3, commentaries. Most people usually jump to commentaries when they think about studying the Bible and wish they had more commentaries, but actually I think it's good to start with handbooks and surveys first, because commentaries get down into the meaning of texts, and we can't get into the meaning of texts until we understand the context of them. So I would start with handbooks and surveys, which we often can find online for free, whereas commentaries are usually hard to find good ones for free. But if you need to find commentaries, these usually focus on one book of the Bible and go through verse by verse after some introductory material. The best commentaries are single commentaries on particular books by scholarly authors. Another challenge with commentaries is that many commentaries are written by well-intentioned pastors. There are good pastors out there writing commentaries, but often they're simply sometimes an uneducated pastor's opinions on a book, rather than a well-thoughtful scholar's commentary with historical backgrounds on a book. So it's a good idea to only invest in commentaries and spend money on commentaries if they're written by a trustworthy scriptural scholar. And you can find a website online that has commentary recommendations that explains the significance of commentaries. And in fact, you can get in contact with us through your TTI discussion leaders if you're ever considering acquiring a commentary. We'd love to point you in the direction of a good commentary. Number 4, Bible atlases. These are books or websites that simply have events about or articles about people, places, and events, when they happened and where they happened in time. 5, Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias. These give definitions and background to concepts, theological ideas, topics, things that happen in the Bible. So, for example, if you're reading through the Bible and you come up on the word drachma, which is an Old Testament coin of a certain value, you would want to find a Bible dictionary to find out what a drachma is and why it's significant. And you can use these Old Testament dictionaries and encyclopedias. Old Testament and New Testament histories. These tend to walk through the Bible in terms of a chronological order, giving you a placement as to where these events happened. That can be very helpful. And then finally, a more general statement, computer software in the internet. For many of you, this is going to be your best resource. There are Bible softwares that can help you understand original languages, can help you search books and find things online. But you need to be careful. There are many sites online written by false teachers or unqualified teachers. So you need to be careful to find things that are trustworthy and reliable. Just because someone looks impressive, just because they claim to have a title, just because they even have a large following does not mean that they are a good resource for biblical information. So we need to look for good and trustworthy sites. And like I said, here's some good sites that you can use even this week as you're preparing your sermons. All right, 2 simple ones that you can write down right now are preceptaustin.org. Preceptaustin.org. That is preceptaustin.org. Again, preceptaustin.org. This is a ministry that merely compiles classic Bible commentaries that are in the public domain, which means they're free, and puts them online for free. And you can search in their text database for any book of the Bible to read these commentaries for free. It's a wonderful resource. They tend to be older commentaries, but that's okay. You can study things like the Henry commentary, which comes from Puritans in New England in the 1800s. It still has solid information about the Bible. A lot of the works of Dr. John MacArthur are available on there for free in his Bible commentaries, which he's made available. So that's an all-text website. It takes very little data to load it, and you can study any book of the Bible in commentary form on that website for free. Another website that is free, biblicaltraining.org. Biblicaltraining.org provides scholarly classes on books of the Bible for free. Seminary classes and commentaries that scholars have chosen to make available for free on there. That takes a little bit more data because most of it is audio and video. But if you have access to an internet cafe or the ability to play some videos or audio, that would be a great website to go to. Another one, africa.thegospelcoalition.org. Africa.thegospelcoalition.org. That one is in your notes. And this is a website that is reputable, godly scholars writing on topics and books of the Bible. That one will be more modern things and more topical things, but it also has occasionally very helpful articles on books of the Bible or ideas for preaching sermons. So those are all great resources that you can go to find out more information. But even more, and most importantly, the best resource you can have for gaining historical information about the Bible is the Bible itself. You need to be reading the Bible in context and understanding the helpful historical books of the Bible, which often provide much of the information that we need to understand the Bible. If you can't master that, then having a huge library of books is not going to change your scholarship as a pastor. What do I mean? Well, we're going to do an exercise together today to illustrate this. I want you to imagine that this Sunday you're going to teach on the book of 1 Timothy. Perhaps some of you are even going to teach on the book of 1 Timothy this Sunday. It'd be a great sermon to teach if you hadn't already done so. But let's ask, how could we learn about the background historically of the book of 1 Timothy? Are there books of the Bible which will already give you the information that you need? And the answer is yes. The book of Acts, which tells us about the author and the audience of the book of 1 Timothy. So here is your exercise for today. Since you don't have commentaries there with you, I want you to go through the book of 1 Timothy using only the book of Acts and answer the questions in your notes. The author of the book of 1 Timothy, who is he? What is his background? When did he write? What kind of ministry did he have? And what was his relationship with the people to which he wrote, or the person to which he wrote, in the case of the book of 1 Timothy? You can find all of those answers in the book of Acts, if you look for them. The audience, who was the book of 1 Timothy written to? Who is this person? What is their background? What is their current circumstance and what's going on with them? You can find all of those answers in the book of Acts. So I want you in the next 15 minutes that we give you to study to go to the book of Acts and see if you can find on your own the background of Timothy. What is the historical or cultural information about the book of 1 Timothy? Where is it being written? You can even find that in the book of Acts. If you look hard enough for it, you'll find out. And then finally summarize how it can help you understand the book of 1 Timothy. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes here to find that information out. I'm not going to tell you where to find it in the book of Acts. You can thumb through your Bible and look for the stories of Timothy and Paul and find out if you can put together a historical and cultural summary of the book of 1 Timothy with just your Bible. And we'll come back in about 15 minutes and I'll explain some of what I have found.